Hello everybody and welcome to Art Talk Thursday. Now today we're going over some pretty darn basic stuff, but remember there are people who don't know these terms. Today we're just going over basic artistic vocabulary. I'm probably going to be leaving out a bunch of terms that some people may know. I just want to work on the core basics that'll help people be able to discuss elements of their artwork with others. Before we start, I would love to give a thanks to my 6 Patreons right now. You guys are helping me out right now and I really appreciate it. Also, to everybody who follows my webtoon, the newest chapter is finally out and I already storyboarded the next one, so I'm excited. Finally things are starting to get going again. It's such a good feeling, and I realize making these videos feeds my soul. So let's get to it. To be completely honest, when I looked up a lot of these words, I knew what they meant, but I kind of forgot them, because even in art school, you kind of expected to know them when you go in already, which is convoluted. I mean, you go there to learn, not to just be like, oh yes, I know this already. What's the point of going to art school if you're going to do that? So anyhow, let's get started. We're going to start off with some basics, then we're going to move into complicated stuff. Got my Wacom pen? Let's go. The first thing I want to go over is composition. Composition is how you organize objects in your artwork, or it can mean an artwork itself. So when we talk about composition, we have to actually talk about a hierarchy of things that go into a composition. The composition is the final piece that has everything in it. Your base unit, though, is a form. Now, forms are shapes and rendering that create units of objects. What do I mean by that? So in this picture, this is an entire composition, but Queen Weiru over here is a form. This person down here, another form. And if you go even further into it, I rendered together different shapes such as the arm, this pole, the head, the different colors to create that form. So you have shapes at the bottom, you render them together to create units of objects, which creates an entire form. And you have multiple forms in one composition. It's extremely convoluted. All you have to know is that things in your picture are forms and you put the forms together to make a composition. Let's summarize it like that. Now that we've kind of discussed composition and how stupid it is, let's go over to the pieces of a composition. Our first big term of the day is pictorial space. Pictorial space is basically just when an artist renders a canvas and creates a visual 3D space on a 2D surface. For instance, let's look at this picture of Shy Drill right now. I rendered the canvas to make it look like there's this tiny itty bitty person next to the ocean and far, far away in the fog is a giant crystalline forest. Pictorial space. Pictorial space goes hand in hand with perspective. Let's look at this one right here. This is from the webtoon. You can see, even though his head is cut off, Lethan is sitting in perspective in a very long hallway, and because of the way he's placed on the ground and his shadows, you can see where he is. It also gives a clue to how tall the hallway is and how far it's going backwards in perspective. Perspective also applies to the body, and it kind of goes hand in hand with foreshortening, but we'll get to that later. You can see over here his foot is in perspective, pointing kind of upwards and towards you, and it matches the rest of the composition. Now, as soon as we start talking about perspective, pictorial space, and compositions, we have to talk about framing. Now, not many art research sites I went to talk about framing, but I personally think it's extremely important. Lots of people who send me pictures for critiques will have a really nice image, and it'll be kind of stuck in a box, kind of like I'm stuck in this tiny little box here. To openly frame something is to let your character stand in a particular place of your composition. I have a few examples to show you. This picture of Kateru right over here is tight framing. He's getting cut off on the bottom, his hair is getting cut off on the top. All you really see is a piece of his face. It's a very tight frame, he's getting stuck in it, right? Then you have open or distant framing, this giant mechanical arm piercing out of the ice of this mountain lake. And our characters, Eidolon, Aerith, and the M character, they're all sitting all the way down here, and they have so much room to breathe. I use that a lot when I do my critiques. I say you need to give your characters room to breathe. This is exactly what I'm talking about. So this is very open framing. Now, what other kind of framings are there? We need to talk about symmetry and balance. Now let's look at this picture of Eidolon right here. This is extremely balanced because if you split the picture half and half, it's basically even on the same side. It has equal visual weight. What about asymmetrical framing though, or asymmetrical balance? Let's look at this picture right over here. We can split the picture in half and half with this line created by the tunnel going backwards, but there's obviously not the exact same thing on the right as on the left. To balance that, there's a certain amount of white on top and a certain amount of white on the bottom, and a certain amount of darkness on each side. There's also a dark head over here, matched by a dark rear side of the cloak. This is asymmetrical balance. It's still a nice balanced composition, but the two sides are not the same. But what if you don't want it balanced? Is it possible to just create, let's say, an extremely imbalanced picture specifically to create discomfort? And yes, it is. That's exactly what I did with this picture. You got a hybrid, a very bright, colorful hybrid, against a complete black background, and it creates this sense of dissonance, this sense of imbalance. It's completely left-weighted, meaning that the detail and the focal points are all sitting on the left, which means there's this giant suction, this giant darkness on the right. You can imbalance your pictures on purpose to get a specific reaction from the audience. So okay, we talked about the basic stuff of proportion. What's next? We can't make this video too long this time, can we? Or maybe we can, because there's so much about art. Next thing I want you to know about is proportion. Lots of people talk about proportion when it comes to like the anatomy of their characters, but proportion also refers to your character versus your entire composition or other characters within the composition. Let's look at the cover for book 2 of the PIRANTINA series. By the way, I'm using all of my art because I don't want to get copyrighted. That's why I'm dragging in everything I've made. Now obviously our main character from the webtoon is tiny compared to Eidolon, e.g. she's smaller in proportion. And then compared to the sky are smaller in proportion. That is the most basic definition I can give you. It's just the size relative to other sizes inside your composition. Next, and I told you we'd talk about this, foreshortening. Now this is a very obvious case of foreshortening. You can kind of be like an Egyptian and draw everything from the side, but then if you want to have something coming towards you, you have to foreshorten it. Look at my hands. Look at my arm. It's foreshortened. It's obvious what's happening, but it's not laid out on the side. Foreshortening is difficult to draw. It's something you really have to learn in practice. It's essentially having something come towards you or go away from you in perspective. Now let's get to the stuff that I really like. First, let's look at emphasis. This ties in with focal point, which we'll get to in a few moments, and if you ever watch my critiques, you'll always hear me talking about focal points. Emphasis is when something in the picture is exaggerated, so that your eye is drawn to it first. Now obviously, with this picture of the illusionist, bam, that eye. Hugely emphasized so that your eyes go to it immediately. This is the emphasis, this is the focal point of the picture. Like for instance, if I had made his purple eye over here a lot brighter and opened it and toned down that eye and maybe gave a bit more color to his little weird straw hat here, then we would have taken the emphasis away from that bright white eye and put it all over, and we would lose our direct, strong focal point. Now, I did exaggerate this a little bit because the illusionist's eye, story-wise, is extremely important. So I made sure to emphasize that point because it is the most important part of his character. That's also called exaggeration. Really blowing a certain part of somebody's body or something in your composition out of proportion, even in an unnatural, comical way, to really bring emphasis to it. Now, emphasis and exaggeration goes hand in hand with dominance and focal point. The focal point in here is this lady's head, and this whiteness compared to everything else is also dominant. Now, why is it dominant? You might notice everything else in this picture is extremely lush and colorful and saturated, but her face is just white. It's washed out, extremely bright compared to everything else. That gives it visual dominance. That creates the focal point. The focal point is also driven by the fact that Eidolon's face back here is getting a little bit dark. You know, there's some darker tones around here and here, and her head is extremely bright. Now, I need to make a video about driving focal points through different techniques, but this is one of the techniques to drive a focal point. We have our extremely bright surface against our dark surface, which means there's high contrast, which means your eyes are brought to focus on it the most. Focal point and dominance. Now, talking about the contrast driving focal point, here is our next word. Contrast. Now, this one's extremely easy to see. Bright blue-white against dark red-black. Extreme contrast in this situation, and it tells a story and you can really use it to your advantage. We're also going to get another vocabulary word, negative space. Now look at this. Her profile is extremely well defined. You can see exactly what's happening against the darkness, but you can see this giant creepy hand pulling out of the darkness also, and see the negative space created by this black against the white defines his claws. So using both the negative space and the contrast, you can drive an extremely compelling composition and story. Another way you can do this is by using focus and blur. The intensity of the colors on this hummingbird mailman are pretty similar to his background, but I put the background out of focus and I put the hummingbird man into focus, which means your focal point is now on him. Focus, blur. What about different ways of creating an object? First, let's go over geometric. Now look at this. Outside of her little head over here and maybe some of the snow, there's no smooth shapes. These don't look like it should have come out of nature. That's geometric. It's when you get hard, flat lines. Like geometry. Pretty easy connection there with the words. On the other end of this, we have organic or freeform. These are the kind of shapes you find in nature. They're round, they're not repetitive, they have parts that just come off. You know, just like go look into nature. That is extremely organic shape language. Look at these rounded, unnatural edges. After geometric and organic shapes, I want to talk about rhythm. Now, rhythm has a bunch of complicated subdivisions, but we're just going to talk about rhythm in general. Rhythm is the repetition of shape to create the illusion of movement. Now, over here, you can see these jagged red lines going over and over and over again, and now on top too, streaming off of the monster. In essence, they're very similar shapes, and they don't really have much use if you jumbled them apart, but once put together in certain patterns, they create the illusion of intense movement. What other places can you see this? Look at illustrations of the ocean. Look at illustrations of lakes, of rivers. Those lines that the artist used to make the water flow from one area to the other, that's rhythm. Patterns can also have rhythm. Now here's one that people should generally know, but some people have been saying they don't know what it is in my Discord chat. Rendering. Rendering is literally just the act of drawing colors and shadows to get the look that you want of your picture. For instance, this cute little doodle over here, it doesn't have that much rendering in it. It's very minimal. This is mostly just line. But Mr. Realistic Yealon over here is extremely highly rendered. In fact, like 5.5 hours of rendered. The rendering was all the shadows and textures put in to make it look the way I wanted, which in this situation was realistic. We're almost to the end, don't worry. One of the last things I want to go over before we jump into the color section is texture. Here's some texture for you. This is a study I did recently trying out the new Photoshop brushes I downloaded. Let's take a close look. Look at these lines. Look at the different bumps, the different holes in the color. That is all texture. Look at the mountains. Look at these little swirls up here with the canvas texture in the background. What's the opposite of texture? The opposite of texture is just a flat, smooth color. But when you start putting these markings in here, you start rendering out something more filled, more complicated. It almost feels like you could drag your fingers over this picture and feel the canvas, simply because of the textures I was using for certain brushes. Texture can be used for contrast. It can be used to highly detail one area instead of the other and bring your focal point to that area. In this situation, I didn't put as much detail in the backside of the mountains nor the sky. Thusly, the busyness of the picture is mostly in this area over here. Whew boy, finally! Okay, we can get into colors now, because color is such a large part of art. Let's jump into this quickly. When talking about colors, you need to know hue, value, intensity, and then saturation and opacity are kinda intertwined, although saturation is also intertwined with intensity. Some people interchange them a lot. Let's just jump over and see what they mean. So let's look at my little color thing all the way on the top right corner. A hue is going to be the purest form of a particular color. For instance, that's a hue. That's a hue. That's a hue. Oops, did I almost choose CMYK there? I almost did. So hue is just an unadulterated, pure form of a color. Now let's talk about value. Value is when you add white or black to change what the color looks like. Let's use this red for an example. This is the most intense, pure form of this red. Now, if we're going to start adding white to it, and if you saw my color theory video, you'll know what's going to happen. Once we start adding white to this, it's going to change its tint. A more and more tinted version of red until we get absolute white. Now let's go the opposite direction. What happens when we start adding black? When you add black to a color, when you add black to a hue, you start getting different shades of that color. And it goes all the way down until you get to black. So remember, tint, add white, shade, add black, and these are all values of red. Now what about intensity? Intensity is a little bit of a fun one because we're going to have to be going diagonally. Now again, if you watched my color theory video, this will make sense. Intensity is when you start adding gray to a color. So we have the pure, most intense form of red right there. Let's take it a step down though. Slowly starting to add gray to this color. More and more gray. This is literally called toning the red down. So all of these colors right over here, these are different tones of red. And tone goes hand in hand with intensity. Saturation and intensity are kind of the same thing. I'm just going to use like a slightly lighter value of white for this. Our opacity is at 100% right now, right? So this is 100% opacity of a tint of red, right? Let's drop that opacity to, let's say 50%. I'm still pressing as hard as I can. But look how light it is. And that's not necessarily because we're mixing the original color. We're mixing the original color with the background. Let's make it go back up to 100%. Let's see what happens when we lay it over the black, over the white, and over the yellow. See? It's completely opaque over it. Now, let's jump to 50%. Let's do exactly what we did again. Black, white, yellow. Now see? Less opacity means that some things can come through. That's all it is. If you want to know more about colors, I'm going to link my color theory video to the end of this one, because I don't want to have to go through complementaries and stuff. Essentially, complementaries are if you have a color wheel and you look at the opposite. A triadic color palette is like make an equilateral triangle and move it around. And analogous are when you have 3 or 4 different colors sliding side by side. But again, look at the color theory video if you want to know about that kind of stuff. For the moment, I want to jump into the rest of what we're talking about. Warm tones and cool tones. How about that? Okay, you can see on our little character in the center here, she has a bunch of warm tones. Got this nice orange color, got this crazy red, if I can pick it up. Yeah, got the red, got the warm brown tone. It's actually more of a neutral brown tone. You can see her body is made up of, that's more of a cool grayish thing right there. But you can see her body is composed of very warm tones. Now Eidolon's body, in contrast, cool tones everywhere, even over here. The highlight. His own blood is a dark blue, and in the background we have more cool tones, just cool tones everywhere. Her color palette is warm. His color palette and the background are cool. Now in a composition, one way to drive a focal point is to put warm tones in front of cool tones. And that's exactly what I did in this situation, just to make sure that she was more of the focus of the eye when you look at it. Now let's quickly jump onto one last thing before we end. That's called mood. If you look at Picasso's pictures, he had his blue face. Those were extremely moody, and he used color to drive an emotion. You can actually do the same thing using saturation, using basically all the different techniques of art. In this situation, I definitely used saturation. This is from the most recent chapter of the webtoon. And what different emotions are you getting from these two? This seems way more welcoming, right? The bright colors, the yellows, the greens. It's sparkling, you have pops of red in there. But then this one is dismal. It's washed out. It's all tones. And because it's all tones, because there's no intense colors, because it's kind of neutral cool, it seems sad, it seems exhausted. And this one, happy, bright, powerful, optimistic. And that is the mood of the picture. Okay, so if you don't want to involve yourself in a tiny little game, you can stop watching. But for the rest of you, I have 3 examples, and I'm going to show you what I did in 2 of them. And the third one's a surprise. So in this picture, just take a guess, without looking at the bottom right. Take a guess of what technique I used to really emphasize this picture. Think for a few moments. I used exaggeration to really force the perspective. Oh yeah, another art term that you need to know, forcing the perspective. Okay, I forced the perspective by exaggerating the size of the character's forward leg and minimalizing the size of the trailing leg. This means it really feels like she's moving extremely quickly, along with the perspective and the blur. Let's try another one. What about this one? And you might be asking, why do I keep showing you webtoon shots? It's because when it comes to visual storytelling, all of these things, all of these art vocabulary I just told you are extremely important, and they can be utilized to really push emphasis on certain parts. Now this picture, I used exaggerated perspective and proportion. Quick Mic down here is so tiny, and then you keep going up and up and up and up and up. And then I even added the rhythm of these lines to make it seem like the hall is also towering and they're pointing to Hilnej. So I used a balanced and symmetrical composition. I used rhythm to point towards perspective, and I emphasized the proportions. That's a mouthful of vocabulary in one sentence for only one composition, right? Now I'm not going to tell you what I did for the last one, but down below in the comments section, I want you, using all the vocabulary you just learned, to tell me what I did with this particular picture and why it works or why it doesn't work. Because remember, I make crappy art sometimes too. I'll read through all of them, and if you get it right, I'll like your comment. So check this one out right here. This is just a landscape study I did. It's digital. Take a look at it for a few seconds. Maybe even pause the video. And write your comment down below. I want to see what you guys think, and I want to see if you learned anything. Okay, I think this video's been long enough. It was an important one, but God, it was a long one. We do still have our Art Block Friday stream tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern, so if you want to come over and just doodle along with me to some nice music in the background, I'd love it if you could join. And as per usual, drink your water, get your sleep, value yourself, believe in yourself, and chase your dreams. I'll see you guys tomorrow, and thank you for watching. Bye-bye.